The fluorescent light above my seat had been flickering for 3 weeks. Nobody fixed it. I used to think that was just how things worked at Duratech. Small things got ignored until someone like me quietly handled them. That morning, I sat under that flickering light and watched my career get handed to someone else. It was a Tuesday, a little after 9 in the morning. The conference room had glass walls, so you could see the whole floor from inside it. 12 of us sat around that long table. There was a plate of pastries nobody touched and a coffee urn that smelled like it had been burning since 6 a.m. Doug Patton stood at the head of the table in his pressed gray suit, and he was smiling the way people smile when they've already made a decision and just need everyone else to catch up. He thanked us all for coming. He talked about the company's direction. He used the word momentum 4 times in 2 minutes. And then he said it. He said that effective immediately, Colton Reed would be stepping into the role of Senior Operations Director. I want you to understand what that title meant. I have been doing that job, not the title, but the actual work for almost 2 years. Routing decisions, compliance oversight, vendor escalations, client relationship management. All of it. Without the title, without the pay, without a single public acknowledgement. I had been told twice by Doug himself that the role was mine when the time was right. Those were his exact words. When the time was right. Apparently, the time was right for Colton. Colton Reed was 31 years old. He had been with Duratech for 22 months. He had never managed a warehouse floor. He had never handled a freight dispute at 11 o'clock at night. He had never sat across from a client who was ready to walk and talk them back into the room. He wore slim-fit suits and carried a leather notebook that I never once saw him write in. But he was confident. He smiled easily. He used the right words in the right rooms. And that, apparently, was enough. When Doug finished speaking, Colton stood up and thanked the team for the opportunity to lead. He said he was excited to build on the strong foundation already in place. He looked around the room when he said it. He did not look at me. I didn't say anything. I didn't move. I sat under that flickering light while everyone else shifted in their seats and gave polite applause and tried not to make eye contact with me. I watched Colton shake Doug's hand. I watched Doug clap him on the shoulder. And I felt something that I still have trouble describing even now. It wasn't anger. Anger is hot. It rises fast and it makes noise. This was something colder. My name is Marcus Hale. I was 47 years old that Tuesday morning. I had given Duratech Logistics 9 years of my life. I came in early and stayed late. I solved problems that no one else even knew existed. I protected that company quietly, consistently, and without complaint. And I sat in that chair under that flickering light and realized clearly and completely that none of it had mattered the way I thought it did. I let the meeting end. I let people file out. I sat still while the room emptied around me, and I made myself a promise, not out loud, not dramatically, just a quiet internal decision. I was done being the foundation that people stood on without ever looking down. What happened next unfolded over about 3 weeks. And by the following morning, the morning after that announcement, Doug Patton was already making phone calls he had not planned to make. Not calls to celebrate, not calls to check in. The kind of calls you make when something is falling apart faster than you expected, and you realize too late that you never understood what was actually holding it together. I know what those calls felt like for him. I didn't answer a single one. I didn't walk into Duratech Logistics with some big plan. I didn't have an MBA. I didn't have a polished pitch or a career roadmap printed out somewhere. I had a work history in distribution and logistics, a solid understanding of how warehouse operations actually function, and a reputation for showing up and handling things. I started as a floor coordinator. That means I was the person making sure the right freight moved to the right dock at the right time. It sounds straightforward. It isn't. Distribution is all about the details. The vendor who always ships short on Fridays. The client whose delivery window is tighter than the contract says, the compliance form that has to be filed before the truck crosses a state line. I learned all of it from the ground up because there was no other way to learn it. Duratech was a mid-sized regional company. We handled industrial parts for manufacturing clients, the kind of businesses that couldn't afford a shipment delay because a delayed shipment meant a production line going quiet. Our clients didn't have patience for mistakes. They had schedules. They had budgets. They had executives who would pull a contract the second they felt like the relationship had slipped. Over 9 years, I built something inside that company. Not my reputation, though that came too. I built the actual systems that kept things running. I created the compliance tracking process that kept us in good standing with 3 different state regulatory agencies. I built the client escalation protocol that gave our biggest accounts a direct line when something went wrong. I negotiated 3 of the company's key vendor agreements personally, sitting across the table, building the kind of trust that doesn't come from a contract template. It comes from a person. I trained 11 people who were later promoted above me. 11. I don't say that to complain. I say it because I want you to understand what kind of man I am. I trained them because I believed in doing the work right. I trained them because I thought good results would be seen and rewarded eventually. I kept my head down and I kept performing. The 4 largest client accounts at Duratech, the ones that together represented 61% of monthly revenue, those relationships ran through me. Not through Doug, not through anyone in a corner office. Through me. Those clients called me directly. They trusted my word. When there was a problem, they wanted Marcus on the phone, not a press release. Outside the office, I had a life that depended on that income staying steady. I had a daughter, Alicia, in her first year at a state university. Tuition, room, board, it added up every month. I had a mortgage on a house I bought 2 years after my divorce, when I finally felt stable enough to plant something. I wasn't living large. I was living responsibly, the way a man does when other people are counting on him. 2 years before that Tuesday meeting, a recruiter had called me. Good offer. Real money. A senior role at a company in the next state over. I had turned it down. I turned it down because Doug Patton had sat across from me at a corner table at a steakhouse near the office and shaken my hand and said, "Marcus, you're the backbone of this place. We're not going to forget that." I believed him. I turned down that offer, stayed in my lane, kept carrying the weight, and waited for the company to do right by me. That was my mistake. Not the work. Not the loyalty. The belief that the people at the top were watching as carefully as I was working. They weren't. They were watching Colton. I want to be fair about Colton Reed. I've thought about this a lot, and I don't think he was a bad person. I don't think he came into Duratech with some plan to take what was mine. I think he was simply a man who had learned how to look the part, and had never been in a room where looking the part wasn't enough. He came from a corporate consulting background. One of those firms where young people in expensive shoes fly into companies, spend 3 weeks asking questions, and then hand over a report full of recommendations that the people who actually do the work could have told them for free. He had an MBA from a school with a good name. He interviewed well. He had a firm handshake and a way of holding eye contact just long enough to seem confident without seeming aggressive. In meetings, Colton spoke with a kind of easy authority. He used phrases like synergy alignment and stakeholder optics and scalable impact framework. People in suits would nod when he said these things. I used to watch that happen and think, does anyone in this room actually know what that means? But it didn't matter. It sounded right. It felt like leadership. And in a lot of companies, feeling like leadership is more than half the battle. What Colton could not do was the actual work. In his first year at Duratech, he missed a compliance window with the State Freight Authority. The filing was late by 11 days. The penalty that came with that was $14,000. I caught it before it fully escalated. I made some calls, submitted a correction, and got the penalty reduced to a written warning. I didn't tell Doug. I just fixed it and moved on. That's what I always did. About 8 months after that, Colton sat in on a contract review meeting with one of our mid-tier clients. He misread a clause in their service agreement, a clause that gave them the right to trigger an early termination if certain delivery benchmarks weren't met 2 quarters in a row. We had just come off a rough quarter. If he had raised that clause in the meeting the way he almost did, it could have put the client on alert and accelerated a conversation we were not ready to have. I caught it the night before the call. I sent a quiet note to the account manager. The meeting went fine, but the moment that stayed with me, the one that made something shift inside me, came about 4 months before the announcement. Colton presented a new routing efficiency plan to the executive team. Slides, charts, a clean little booklet with the company logo on the cover. Doug loved it. The VP of sales called it exactly the kind of fresh thinking we need. I sat in the back of that room and recognized almost every idea in that presentation. Not similar ideas, the same ideas, the same logic, the same structure, the same language I had used in an internal memo I wrote and submitted 2 years earlier. A memo that Doug had read, acknowledged with a 2-line email, and never mentioned again. I didn't say anything that day either. I kept thinking that doing the work was enough. That results would speak on their own. That a man who built real things didn't need to fight for credit, because the things he built would eventually make it obvious. I was wrong about that too. What I understand now is that Colton wasn't the problem. Not really. The problem was a system that rewarded the performance of competence over competence itself. Colton performed it well. I just performed the actual job. And when they gave him the title, something in me went very quiet. When Marcus Hale goes quiet, he starts thinking. The room cleared fast. People had places to be, or at least they wanted to look like they did. A few of them glanced at me on the way out. Not long looks, just quick ones. The kind that say, "I'm sorry," without risking the discomfort of actually saying it. I understood. I didn't hold it against them. I was still sitting in my chair when Doug caught my eye through the glass wall. He tilted his head toward his office. A small gesture. "Come see me." I stood up, buttoned my jacket-out habit, and walked down the hall. 12 steps. I counted them. Doug's office had a window that looked out over the parking lot. He always kept the blinds half open, which I think was intentional. It gave him somewhere to look when he didn't want to hold eye contact. He closed the door behind me. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. I sat down. He stayed standing for a moment, then sat too. He started talking the way people talk when they've rehearsed what they're going to say, but are hoping they won't have to say all of it. He talked about organizational growth trajectories. He talked about fresh energy and new perspectives. He talked about how the company was entering a phase that required a different kind of visible leadership. I let him talk. I watched his hands. He kept straightening a pen on his desk that didn't need straightening. Then he got to the part he had been building toward. He said that while my contributions were invaluable, he used that word, invaluable, the company wanted to keep me in a central role. He said I would be moving into a position called Senior Operational Advisor. He described it carefully. No direct reports, no budget authority, an advisory function, he said, that would allow me to share my expertise across departments, and a salary reduction of $9,000 a year. I'll let the silence sit for a moment. Then I asked him one question. Was this decision already made? I said, when you shook my hand last April and told me I was next. He stopped straightening the pen. He looked at the window. He looked back at me. And then he said, "Marcus, this isn't personal." That was his answer. Not a yes. Not a no. Just that line. The line people use when they want to close a door without admitting they locked it. I nodded. I thanked him for the conversation. I stood up, straightened my jacket again, and walked back down the hall. 12 steps. Same as before. Except this time, I wasn't counting to stay calm. I was counting because my mind was already somewhere else entirely. I sat down at my desk. I opened my laptop, and I started making a list. Not a list of complaints. Not a list of everything I deserved and didn't get. A different kind of list. I wrote down every process at Duratech that lived only in my head. Every undocumented system. Every client relationship that functioned because of my personal credibility with the person on the other end of the phone. Every compliance deadline that existed in my calendar and nowhere else. Every vendor agreement where my name wasn't just on the contract. It was the reason the contract worked. I filled 2 full pages. Then I opened my calendar and submitted a request for 3 personal days starting Thursday. I told Doug it was a family matter. He approved it within the hour. I could almost feel the relief in that approval. The sense that the hard conversation was behind him and everything had gone smoothly. It hadn't gone smoothly. It had gone quiet. And there's a very big difference between those two things. Doug had spent 20 minutes explaining why I wasn't valuable enough for the title I had earned. He had no idea he had just spent 20 minutes explaining exactly why he couldn't afford to lose me. But he was about to find out. Those 3 days away from the office were the quietest and most productive days I had experienced in years. I didn't spend them angry. I didn't spend them on the phone complaining to friends or replaying the meeting in my head, looking for moments where I should have spoken up. I spent them thinking clearly, more clearly than I had in a long time. Because when you stop trying to protect something that isn't protecting you back, your mind gets very sharp very fast. The first call I made was to a man named David Okafor. David was a recruiter who had been reaching out to me on and off for 14 months. He represented Carver Industrial Services, a regional logistics and distribution company, direct competitor to Duratech, slightly larger and growing. Every time David called, I had thanked him politely and told him I was happy where I was. I had said that so many times I had started to believe it. I called him back on a Thursday morning from my kitchen table. I told him I was ready to talk. By Friday afternoon, I was sitting across from Carver's VP of Operations in a conference room that had working lights and fresh coffee. The conversation lasted 2 hours. They knew my reputation. They had been watching my work from the outside for over a year. The client relationships I managed, the operational stability I had brought to Duratech's accounts, the compliance record. They had done their homework. They offered me the role of Director of Distribution Operations. The salary was $31,000 more per year than what I was currently making. Not what Doug had tried to reduce me to. What I was making before the reduction. $31,000 on top of that. I told them I needed 1 week to think it over. They said that was fine. I drove home and sat in my driveway for about 10 minutes before going inside. The second thing I did that weekend was call Frank DeLuca. Frank was the operations manager at Belco Manufacturing, Duratech's single largest client. Belco represented 22% of Duratech's monthly revenue. Frank and I had worked together for 6 years. He called me Marcus, and I called him Frank, and we had solved more problems together over the phone than most people solve in meetings all year. I wasn't calling to poach him. I wasn't calling to say anything negative about Duratech. I just called to check in the way I always did. We talked for about 20 minutes, and partway through the conversation, without me asking, Frank said something that I wrote down word for word after we hung up. He said, "Marcus, honestly, some of us have been wondering what's going on over there lately. Colton sat in on our last operations call, and he didn't know what contract tier we were on. We've been with Duratech for 6 years. He didn't know our tier." I told Frank I appreciated him sharing that. I kept my voice even. We finished the conversation and said goodbye the way we always did. After that call, I pulled up the 3 vendor agreements I had personally negotiated over the years. I read through each one carefully. 2 of them contained relationship clauses, specific language that named the account manager responsible for the partnership. My name was in both of them, not Duratech's name. My name. Those clauses existed because the vendors had insisted on them. They had wanted the protection of knowing that the person they trusted would remain their point of contact. At the time, Doug had signed off on that language without fully understanding what it meant. I had understood exactly what it meant. Then I checked the compliance calendar I maintained on my personal system. 3 regulatory filings were due in the next 19 days. A state freight carrier certification renewal. A hazardous materials handling update for one of our warehouse zones. A vendor insurance verification submission. All 3 were on my calendar. None of them were documented anywhere that Colton or anyone else at Duratech could easily find. I didn't delete anything. I didn't move anything. I didn't warn anyone. I simply looked at the full picture of what I'd been carrying quietly, alone, without recognition, and I made a decision. I was done, not out of bitterness, out of clarity. There's a difference. Bitterness wants to hurt something. Clarity just stops holding something up that was never going to hold you up in return. I called David Okafor on Monday morning and accepted the offer from Carver. My start date was 11 days away. I went back to work at Duratech that Tuesday like nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I submitted my resignation letter the following Monday morning at 8 o'clock. 2 sentences of thanks. 2 weeks' notice as required by my contract. Professional. Clean. No drama. I know exactly when Doug read it, because he was standing at my desk by 8:31. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had just realized he left something important on a train that was already pulling away from the station. He sat down in the chair across from my desk, the same chair where junior staff used to sit when they needed guidance. And he asked me if this was a negotiation. I told him it wasn't. He asked what it would take. I looked at him for a moment before I answered. Not to be dramatic, just because I wanted to say it right. About 9 months ago, I said, it would have taken a title and a fair salary. Today, nothing. He sat with that for a second. Then he started talking about counteroffers and transition periods, and how much the company valued my institutional knowledge. He used the phrase, institutional knowledge, 3 times. 2 weeks earlier, he had used the word invaluable. The vocabulary of appreciation always got richer the moment I became inconvenient. I listened. I thanked him again, and I went back to work. The rest of that day moved slowly. I started clearing my desk in small stages, not all at once, not in a way that made a scene. A few personal items into my bag. A few files transferred to the shared drive for whoever would need them next. I was methodical about it. People came by in ones and twos throughout the day. Quiet conversations. A few handshakes. A man from the freight team, named Oscar, who I had helped through a difficult client situation 2 years back, stopped by just to say he was sorry to see me go. I told him he was going to be fine. Raina, my assistant of 4 years, cried. She tried not to, but she did. She told me she had already updated her resume. I told her she didn't need to change a single thing on it. Her work spoke for itself. She nodded and walked away quickly. Gerald came by near the end of the day. Gerald ran the main warehouse floor and had worked alongside me for 6 years. He was not a man who said much. He walked up to my desk, gripped my shoulder once, firmly, and walked away without a word. That meant more to me than most of the conversations I had that day. Colton walked past my desk twice. He did not stop. He did not say anything. I don't know what he was thinking. I didn't spend much time wondering. That evening I drove home and found my daughter Alicia there. She had come back for the weekend. We ate dinner together at the kitchen table, just the two of us, and somewhere between the meal and the cleanup, I told her I had taken a new job. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me. She asked if I was okay. I thought about the question honestly before I answered it. I thought about the flickering light and the leather notebook and the pen Doug kept straightening on his desk. I thought about 9 years and 2 pages of a list and a phone call from my kitchen table on a Thursday morning. I'm better than okay, I told her. I just stopped waiting for permission. She smiled at that. She didn't ask for more details, and I didn't offer them. There would be time for the full story later. What I didn't tell her, what I had no reason to tell her yet, was that by the time my last official day at Duratech arrived, things had already started coming apart. Quietly. The way a structure starts to fail before anyone on the outside notices anything wrong. The cracks were already there. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened next. I did not sabotage anything. I did not make calls to cause problems. I did not tip anyone off or pull any strings or do anything that a reasonable person could look at and call wrong. I completed my work during those 2 weeks professionally and thoroughly. I answered every email. I showed up every day. I did what was asked of me. What I did not do was volunteer information that nobody had thought to ask for. That distinction matters, because what unfolded over those 2 weeks was not the result of anything I did. It was the result of everything I had been doing for 9 years, suddenly stopping. The first problem surfaced in the middle of my second week. The state freight carrier certification renewal, a filing I had handled every year for the past 7 years, came due on a Thursday. It was on my calendar. It was not on anyone else's. It was not in any shared system. It was not in any handbook or operations manual, because nobody had ever asked me to write one, and I had never thought to do it without being asked. I had just handled it, year after year, the way you handle something when you're the only person who knows it needs handling. It was missed entirely. The penalty that followed was $23,000, nearly double the one Colton had nearly caused in his first year, the one I had quietly fixed before it fully landed. This one landed completely. There was no one to catch it. There was no one who even knew to look. I heard about it through Gerald, who texted me 2 days after my last day. He didn't ask me to do anything about it. He just wanted me to know. The second problem was bigger. Belco Manufacturing formally requested a client relationship review meeting. They sent the request directly to Duratech's VP of Sales. In the request, they asked that Marcus Hale be present for the conversation. When they were told that Marcus Hale had resigned, their procurement director sent an email. I never saw the email directly, but the contents made their way to me through a channel I'll leave unnamed. The email expressed, in careful, professional language, significant concern about continuity. It asked pointed questions about who would be managing the Belco relationship going forward and what Duratec's plan was to ensure the service level did not change. 2 days after that email, Belco's legal team contacted Duratec and invoked a 60-day reassessment clause embedded in their service contract. That clause gave Belco the right to pause and review the terms of the agreement if there was a significant change in key personnel. I had told Doug that clause existed. 2 years earlier, during a contract review meeting, I had flagged it specifically and explained what could trigger it. Doug had looked at the clause, nodded, and told me it was a non-issue. He said no client was going to walk over a personnel change. He was finding out now that some clients might. The third problem was quieter, but just as telling. One of the vendor agreements, the one with my name written into the relationship clause, ran into a dispute when a routine order was mishandled by the new coordination team. The vendor's regional representative, a man I had worked with for 4 years, called my personal cell phone. I answered. I was polite. I was professional. I told him clearly and without any edge in my voice that I no longer represented Duratec Logistics and that he should direct his concerns to Colton Reed, the new senior operations director. The call lasted 4 minutes. I don't know what happened after that call. I didn't follow up. It wasn't my place to. I thought about all of it. The filing, the client, the vendor, and I felt something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite sadness. It was closer to the feeling you get when a thing you knew was going to happen finally happens. I hadn't burned anything down. I had just stopped standing in front of the fire. Carver Industrial Services felt different from the first week. The office was newer, but that wasn't it. The salary was better, but that wasn't it either. It was something harder to name. It was the feeling of being in a room where people actually wanted to know what you thought, where your opinion wasn't just tolerated. It was the reason they had hired you. I had forgotten what that felt like. I hadn't realized how long I had been working without it. I was 3 weeks into my role as Director of Distribution Operations when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. Not because the conversation was good for me, but because it was the moment the whole picture finally came fully into focus. It was Doug Patton. He opened with small talk, asked how I was settling in, said he had heard good things, which told me he had been asking around, which told me more than he intended. And then, after about 90 seconds of warmth he hadn't earned, he got to the reason for the call. He asked if I would consider a short-term consulting arrangement. Just to help with the transition, he said. A few weeks, maybe a month. Help with the new team oriented on some of the accounts and processes. Nothing major. I asked him what rate he had in mind. He gave me a number. It was generous by normal standards. It was nowhere near what the work would actually be worth. Not the institutional knowledge, not the client trust, not the 7 years of compliance history that existed primarily in my memory. I told him that for the kind of knowledge he was asking me to bring back, the number should probably be about 3 times higher. There was a long pause on the line. He said he would need to check with finance and get back to me. I told him to take his time. He never called back. I didn't expect him to. The call was never really about consulting. It was about Doug realizing fully, finally, what he had let walk out the door, and not being able to admit, even to himself, exactly how much it was worth. 6 weeks after my last day at Duratec, Belco Manufacturing formally ended their contract. I heard it from Frank DeLuca, who called me on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week as the announcement that had started all of this. I thought about that briefly. Then I listened to what Frank had to say. He told me Belco had made the decision after the reassessment period. The relationship had deteriorated too quickly. The new team hadn't been able to demonstrate the service continuity Belco needed at their volume. It wasn't personal, Frank said. It was operational. Then he paused. Then he asked if Carver Industrial Services would be in a position to handle Belco's distribution volume. I told him I would have a proposal ready within 48 hours. I closed my office door after that call. I sat at my desk, my new desk in my new building with a title that matched the work I had always been doing, and I stayed quiet for a while. Not sad, not triumphant in any loud way, just still. I thought about what 9 years of unrecognized loyalty actually costs a man. Not just in salary, though that part is real and it adds up, It costs you something harder to calculate. It costs you time that doesn't come back. It costs you the slow erosion of trusting your own judgment. Because when good work goes unseen long enough, you start to wonder if maybe you're not reading the room right. Maybe you're not as valuable as you think. Maybe patience is the right strategy and your moment is still coming. That erosion is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in. What I know now, what I wish I had understood years earlier, is that knowing your own value is not arrogance. It is not disloyalty. It is not impatience. It is the most basic and necessary form of self-respect a working man can have. You can be humble and still know what you're worth. You can be loyal and still recognize when loyalty has become a one-way street. The lesson I took from all of it is not about revenge. Revenge requires you to stay focused on the person who hurt you. I stopped doing that a long time ago. The lesson is about recognition. Specifically, recognizing your own value before you spend another year waiting for someone else to do it for you. Doug Patton promoted Colton Reed on a Tuesday morning. By Wednesday, he was already making calls he hadn't planned to make. I know, because I didn't answer them.